Good evening, and thank you all for joining us this evening. My name is Saul Shipp. I'm a board member of the Canadian Friends of Peace Now with the Toronto chapter. As most of you know, CFPN is a partner of Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, Israel's leading peace movement, which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find out everything about us on our website, peacenowcanada.org. After the presentation from Professor Waxman, we will leave time for audience questions. Please type your questions at any time in the Q&A feature at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen. If you wish, you can also include where you are writing from. Please make your question as concise as possible. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website, as are all our previous webinars. So as our guest today, we're extremely honored to have Professor Dov Waxman of the University of California at Los Angeles, discussing the judicial coup and annexation of the West Bank. Dov is originally from London, England, and is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. He's also been a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University, Bar Ilan, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as Oxford University. His research focuses on the conflict over Israel-Palestine, Israeli politics and foreign policy, US-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, and anti-Semitism. He's the author of many dozens of articles and 4 books, including his most recent book, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. So Dov, thank you very much for joining us today. I'll get the ball rolling with the first question. Large number of Israelis believe that Israeli democracy is in danger because of the Netanyahu government's plans to overhaul the judiciary. Could you briefly summarize why there is so much concern and whether you share these concerns?
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank you for hosting me today and thank Canadian Friends of Peace Now for giving me the opportunity to talk about this issue, which I think is very important, not only for Israel's future, but also for the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, as we will shortly discuss. In terms of the judicial overhaul, that the Israeli government calls it a judicial reform, I think it's more of a constitutional coup. I do think there is real reasons for concern about what's contained in this package. And I think to understand why, we need to really take a close look at what the government is proposing. I want to focus on, a couple of elements of this, of the proposed legislation, which I think really clarify why this is a dangerous piece of legislation, or why this judicial overhaul really is more of a judicial coup rather than simply a more kind of innocuous sounding judicial reform. So the first big element to understand concerns the power of the Supreme Court, the power to engage in judicial review. And this is not a power that the Supreme Court has always had. It's important to recognize that. It's a power that the Supreme Court really gained under the leadership of Aharon Barak in the mid-1990s. The Supreme Court has started to really use this power of judicial review to veto legislation that contradicts Israel's basic laws. And so essentially what the government is trying to do is to limit the Supreme Court's ability to do this very severely. One way it would do this is by requiring unanimity among all the justices, all 15 justices, in order to veto any law passed by the Knesset. It would also make basic laws immune from judicial review and allow the government to basically declare any law a basic law and thereby immunize it from judicial review. And in the rare event that the Supreme Court does veto a law that's passed by the Knesset, the so-called override clause would essentially allow a simple majority, 61 members of the Knesset, to reintroduce that law and override the Supreme Court's veto. So essentially, this would really almost completely nullified the Supreme Court's power of judicial review. The second key element in these judicial reforms concerns the appointment process, how judges are appointed. And the current system is that there is a committee that includes equal representation of politicians, both from the government and the opposition, sitting judges and lawyers. And essentially, none of those groups can control the judicial appointments process. There has to be a consensus. What the government is proposing is to essentially reform that committee, which would to give the government essentially the power on the committee and allow it to enjoy an automatic majority and therefore have complete control over judicial appointments, which in turn would severely undermine the independence of the judiciary because they would really be appointed by the governing coalition. So you take those two elements together, the judicial review and judicial appointments, essentially the government would have complete control over the appointment of new justices. The High Court would be very restricted in its ability to invalidate new laws, and even if they were invalidated, that could be overruled. And on top of that, the proposal includes allowing ministers to pick their own legal advisors. So altogether, these reforms would really seriously weaken the power and independence of Israel's judiciary. Now, the question is, is this a threat to Israeli democracy? On the one hand, of course, I think it's important to at least acknowledge the argument made by the government and its supporters in favor of this judicial reform, which is that they see the current arrangement as undemocratic. In particular, they see the Supreme Court as an undemocratic institution because as far as they're concerned, it essentially is a bunch of unelected justices invalidating the will of the people, overruling Israeli governments and invalidating, therefore, the will of the people. So it's being presented or framed by the government and its supporters as actually increasing Israeli democracy by removing this unelected, by weakening the power of these unelected justices and their ability to kind of veto the will of the majority. I think that understanding of democracy, however, is seriously flawed. Essentially, what the government and its supporters are arguing is that democracy is simply majority rule. And, it's whatever the majority want. A fuller understanding of democracy, on the other hand, at least liberal democracy, is one in which there is checks on the power of the executive branch. There is the rule of law. There are the protection of rights for minorities. And the government cannot act without restraint. So I happen to subscribe to that understanding, not the minimalist or majoritarian understanding of democracy, but rather this understanding of democracy as requiring limits on the power of the executive branch. And I think if these reforms are enacted, essentially it would severely impact Israeli democracy insofar as it would give the government more or less unfettered power and allow, therefore, the government to do whatever it wants, including restrict the rights of minority groups and others, as well as potentially banning our political parties and doing all sorts of other actions which would violate any sort of democratic norms. So I do share those concerns of the protesters and of the opponents. But where I differ is that I think, the opposition has really kind of held up, has made the argument that essentially, this is a threat to Israel as a liberal democracy. The Supreme Court is this bastion of liberalism, and essentially what they want to do is to maintain the status quo and to defend Israeli democracy. I think really that the threat to Israeli democracy goes well beyond this judicial reform. That actually the most serious threat to Israeli democracy lies in its continued now 56-year rule over Palestinians in the West Bank and to a lesser extent in the Gaza Strip as well. And that it's really a myth that the Supreme Court has been, in fact, this bastion of liberalism, that it has always served as this check on government power. And that, if absent this judicial reform, if this judicial reform is stopped, that somehow Israel will be or remain a great liberal democracy. I would say that Israel has never been really a liberal democracy. It's always been a kind of semi-liberal democracy, and in many ways a deeply flawed democracy. And certainly with regards to Israeli rule over the West Bank, it's really hard to call Israel a democracy because of that ongoing occupation.
Okay, that's a great overview and introduction. I think a lot of us are familiar with those arguments. But before we get into more detail, right now the coalition and opposition representatives are in talks to try to reach a compromise on judicial reform. Have you any idea how the talks are progressing? What kind of compromise might be possible, and what might happen if the talks fail?
Well, like everybody, I'm just reading the reports in the Israeli media. I don't have any, insider information about how the talks are going. From what it appears, they haven't really got down to serious business yet. It's mostly been working out the kind of technical details of the talks rather than really substantive talks. The reports that are at least coming from the Israeli media don't really give one much cause for hope. It seems that nobody really has much expectation, except maybe for President Herzog, that these talks will actually yield a compromise. I do think, however, that a compromise is possible. I think if both sides were really interested and willing to reach a compromise, it would be possible to reach a compromise, because I actually think there's a pretty broad agreement among many Israelis that there is a need for some kind of judicial reform. There's not a complete opposition to the very idea of judicial reform. The concern is not, the opposition isn't against judicial reform. The opposition is against a judicial reform that would leave the governing coalition with absolute power. So I think actually what President Herzog proposed a month or so ago, is a fairly good outline of a compromise. This would essentially be one in which the Supreme Court's ability to strike down laws would be limited, but it would still maintain that ability. The Judicial Appointments Committee would be changed so that there would be, but it would maintain a balance of power so that the government would not have complete control over the process. So I think there were elements, and when President Herzog introduced those reforms, he did so after consulting with, lots of people on all sides, and I think those was a reasonable compromise, which actually the opposition parties, at least Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, kind of accepted, and the government rejected. And I think the rejection of Herzog's reform proposal, and what we've been hearing from ministers in the government, particularly Justice Minister Levin, but also from the far-right ministers, from Smotrich and Ben Gvir, suggest that they're really not interested in any kind of compromise. That basically they are committed to pushing through this entire package. And although, the government is engaging in these negotiations, it's really not clear, whether this is indicates a serious willingness on the part of the government to reach a compromise, or is merely a tactic aimed at buying time with the hope that the protest movement will, gradually lose its energy, lose its momentum, and allow the government, once the protests die down, to push through these reforms. And the fear is, at least among the protesters in Israel, is that the government is kind of following the playbook of the Polish government, which introduced a similar kind of evisceration of its constitutional court. And so there's kind of a similar tactic. So it's not clear whether there's a serious will on the part of the Israeli government. I suspect maybe that Netanyahu himself would indeed like to find a compromise. I think this has become more trouble than it's worth for him, but I'm not sure he has the ability to control his government, particularly those far-right parties who I think are, ideologically committed to eviscerating the power of the Supreme Court. And it's not even clear whether within his own Likud party, Netanyahu can bring them along, because along with Levine, there are other hardliners in the Likud who are really committed to this judicial overhaul. So I'm not optimistic that a compromise will be found. And I should also note that it's not clear that the opposition parties, who are negotiating with the government, actually could accept a compromise, and that would stop the demonstrations, because there's a much wider protest movement, which is not led by the opposition parties. And so even if a compromise were reached, the protesters might still reject it and might still say it's not good enough, because what they want is just the judicial overhaul to be scrapped altogether. So I'm not optimistic, and I would say that, if the talks do fail, then I think very quickly we will see the government move forward with its existing legislation.
I've read some opinions, including one this week by Naomi Chazan in Times of Israel, that Netanyahu would actually like to see the talks fail and would like to just drop the whole issue, let it fade into the background, because it's too much trouble for him to try to get through.
Yeah, I think he certainly underestimated the depth and the extent and the ferocity of the opposition. I think there was a kind of arrogance, overconfidence on the part of the government that after the election, they would really, with this solid majority in the Knesset of 64 members, that they would be able to push this through relatively easily. They clearly miscalculated, and I think Netanyahu has realized that many other aspects of what he wants to do, both particularly in terms of foreign policy, are now being jeopardized by this, and not to mention, of course, the Israeli economy, which he's really built his reputation upon as a kind of steward of Israel's economic growth. But as I said, I think what the Netanyahu we're dealing with today is not the Netanyahu of old, insofar as this is a leader who, while still in control of his own party, it's more or less, Likud has become a kind of personality cult for Netanyahu. I don't think he controls the Likud. He is in a very weak position. Otherwise, he's controlled much more by his coalition partners, because he has no other options for coalition partners. He's burned his bridges with all his former allies on the right. And so, it's unlikely that he can find other parties to replace, say, the far right parties, which he might want to do, but I don't think he's able to replace them. And so for him, if he doesn't do their bidding, essentially, if he doesn't stick with this judicial overhaul, he could lose his government. And of course, the loss of his government means potentially a threat to Netanyahu's own personal freedom, because his trial for corruption continues.
So let's get into, so to what extent is this attack on the judiciary connected to the occupation of the West Bank that you started out with, at the West Bank and Gaza? And how have past legal rulings about the occupation and settlement expansion contributed to the coalition's desire to take power away from the judiciary?
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognize the intimate connection between the judicial overhaul and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And one of the things that kind of frustrates me in some of the reporting on this outside of Israel has been, the way in which the judicial overhaul has sometimes been presented as just a ploy by Netanyahu to get out of his corruption cases, right? That this is just about Netanyahu's own legal troubles, or it's just a domestic issue in Israel. It's just an internal Israeli issue. And in actual fact, this isn't just a domestic issue, and it's definitely intimately related to Israel's occupation. First of all, because we can't understand why the right, the Israeli right, broadly speaking, and especially the far right, is going after the Supreme Court without understanding the fact that its opposition, its antipathy to the Supreme Court is largely because of what the previous courts' rulings that have limited what the Israeli government and Israeli settlers can do in the West Bank. And this goes back a long way. This isn't just over the last few years. I mean, most famously in 1979, the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice ruled that it was that land could not be taken from Palestinians under the auspices of security reasons to then be used to build Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That was a very important ruling. And more recently, in 2020, the court invalidated a law that allowed the state to expropriate private Palestinian land for unauthorized, on which unauthorized outposts, illegal Israeli settlements, if you will, have been built. And there are other rulings that the court has done which have, to some degree, restricted what Israel has been able to do in the West Bank. And that's really the main reason why the Israeli right is going after this. That's why the Supreme Court has become public enemy number one in the eyes of the Israeli. The ultra-Orthodox parties have different gripes with the Supreme Court, but for the Israeli right, it's largely because the court has restrained, not prevented, but restrained what Israel can do in the West Bank. And why? And it's not just about settling scores, if you will, with the Supreme Court. It's also about ensuring that in the future, the Supreme Court cannot be an obstacle to the Israeli rights agenda in the West Bank. Basically, the agenda is clear. I mean, they're not secretive about this agenda. They're very explicit. The actual coalition guidelines that Netanyahu negotiated with the far-right parties are explicit in what the right wants to do, which is basically to formally, legally annex, or in their terminology, apply Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank, to formalize the system of Israeli control, which is really akin to a kind of apartheid rule in the West Bank, two different legal systems for Israeli settlers and for Palestinian civilians. And the Supreme Court is seen as a potential obstacle in the way of that agenda. And so the hope is that by eviscerating the independence and power of the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court would essentially be muted and would be unable to prevent or block the Israeli right from pursuing this annexationist agenda. So it's part and parcel of this broader plan, which, as I said, the right are very explicit about. And that's why I think we cannot just see this as a domestic issue, as a matter of concern only for Israelis. This is a matter of concern, not just for Israelis, but certainly for Palestinians, and indeed for anyone who cares about their futures.
And just in the last 3 or 4 months, what has this regime done to exacerbate relations with the Palestinians and to try to destroy prospects for a two-state solution? What else?
It's a long list. Somebody who closely follows Israel and Israeli-Palestinian relations, I must say it's been hard to keep up with the pace of developments over the last few months. It seems like barely a day goes by when some new law, some new piece of legislation is introduced, a new decision is made. I mean, it's really a lot. And this is just in the space of just 3 months, right? This is government for, has been in office a very short amount of time, and it's already, I think made a number of decisions that have really impacted negatively Israeli-Palestinian relations. I should note before I talk about those that, this in some respects, the Netanyahu government's actions are a continuation of the previous governments. I don't want to suggest that it's a radical break from the previous government's actions, particularly in terms of the IDF activity, the Israeli army's activities in the West Bank, and carrying out raids in the West Bank, etc. The escalation of violence in the West Bank, I think more than 90 Palestinians, militants and civilians have been killed so far this year. Last year, the deadliest year for Palestinians since the end of the Second Intifada. This current escalation or wave of Israeli-Palestinian violence didn't begin with this government. It really began with the prior government, and so it's continued since then. But this government has certainly exacerbated what was already a deteriorating situation in the West Bank, was already a tense situation. So just to point out a few of the kind of highlights or lowlights, if you like, one is the decision to legalize settlement outposts. These are Israeli settlements in the West Bank that are illegal under Israeli law. Of course, all Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law, but these so-called outposts were not authorized by the Israeli government. They're illegal under Israeli law. The government has legalized I believe nine of those outposts, and has declared its intention to legalize all of the rest. It has also approved more than 7,000 new housing units, new units in existing Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That's more than the number that was approved in the last year and the year before that. I think Peace Now, Peace Now Settlement Watch noted not just that the high number of new housing units that have been approved, but their location. And that's particularly important, because it's one thing to build more units in settlements adjacent to the Green Line. That doesn't necessarily undermine the prospects for a two-state solution. But the settlements, the housing units are being built in settlements that are located deep inside the West Bank. And those are the settlements in particular that really make any sort of two-state solution difficult to implement. In addition to that, they passed a law that allows the return of settlers to 4 West Bank settlements that were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's disengagement under then Prime Minister Sharon. So in terms of this kind of settlement aspect, we see a clear acceleration of settlement building and the legalization of settlement outposts. That's all on what we might call the de facto annexation front. In other words, these are actions that aren't formally, legally annexing the West Bank, but essentially de facto continue this long process and accelerate this process of de facto annexation. But no less, and perhaps even more important, are the actions that the government has done to advance de jure legal annexation of the West Bank, and in particular, the decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu to transfer the control over 2 military bodies, two bodies that were part of the IDF, under the authority of the finance minister, to place them under the authority of Bezalel Smotrich of the far-right religious Zionist party, who's the finance minister. That essentially transferring control over these institutions that were within the purview of the IDF amounts to de jure annexation, because now a civilian minister, or at least his appointee, is going to have control over these things. And these institutions, this is the civil administration and the Kogat, have a lot of power in the West Bank over the lives of both Palestinians and Jewish settlers. And so, Netanyahu has basically given Smotrich, who is himself a settler, a lot of governing powers in the West Bank, specifically in the 60% of the West Bank in Area C. And so, that has been understood, including by Israel's own, I think, the military's legal staff, as amounting to de jure annexation. And on top of all of that, I could go on, but I'll just mention one other thing that I think is worth noting, are the sanctions, punitive sanctions that the government has imposed on the Palestinian Authority in response to the PA's request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on Israel's occupation of the West Bank. The Palestinian authorities are hoping that the ICJ will rule that occupation is no longer legal, and to punish the PA for going to the ICJ, the Netanyahu government has diverted tax money that Israel collects on behalf of the Palestinian Authority, money that really is a large part of the PA's budget. It's now essentially diverted that money, which is Palestinian money, to a fund for Israeli victims of Palestinian terrorism. They've also prohibited any new construction in Area C, that is the 60% of the West Bank under full Israeli control, and placed restrictions on Palestinian officials. So, altogether, really exacerbated Israeli-Palestinian tensions. And, I could go on to talk about some of the things that's happened on the Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, the Temple Mount. But I think this gives you a good idea of some of the dangerous measures that the Israeli government has taken.
That's a lot for three and a half months. So coming to U.S. relations, Joe Biden and his administration have made some unusually pointed criticisms of the judicial overhaul and also of the security cabinet decision to legalize the outposts in the West Bank. So what's the state of Israeli-U.S. relations right now, and how do you see them developing in the next months?
Well, I think there's certainly tension. I think the Biden administration, from the outset, has done its absolute best to avoid that tension spilling out into the public domain. They've wanted to keep whatever misgivings and concerns they have with Israel's actions private. President Biden, obviously, strong supporter of Israel, and also having been President Obama's vice president, saw that caused some damage to the Obama administration. So really wanted to keep his disagreements with Israel private and behind the scenes. The fact that they've gone public over those issues, as you mentioned, indicates to me how exasperated they've become with the Israeli government, because as I said, their general inclination is to avoid public disputes and to quietly work behind the scenes, but that hasn't worked, frankly. I think they've seen that their quiet diplomacy, if you will, to encourage the Israeli government to reach a compromise over its judicial reform and to consult more, that didn't work. The government plowed ahead. It rejected President Herzog's proposals. That's what I think then led President Biden to state publicly and quite bluntly, his opposition to that judicial reform. And then the government's decision to the passage of this law allowing Israeli settlers back into those 4 settlements that had been evacuated, that really rankled the administration, because it's not really because it's going to significantly make a big difference on the ground. It's the reason they were so upset, and in fact they called the Israeli ambassador for a meeting at the State Department, which is in diplomatic speak a very serious thing. That's because that violated an agreement that Israel had made at the time with the George W. Bush administration. And so that was seen as something that actually violated an American-Israeli agreement. So I think clearly the Biden administration is frustrated, increasingly impatient with the government, with the Netanyahu government. But they don't want to have a fight with Netanyahu. They know all too well that Netanyahu has strong support in Congress, particularly obviously in the Republican Party, and he can make Biden's life difficult. Let's not forget, of course, that we're entering another presidential election in the United States. Biden is running again. So I think they're really wary about having a public dispute. They've also got, of course, the Iranian nuclear issue as well, which they need Israel's cooperation with. So, I think there is tension. I think I doubt it will boil over into the kind of public fights that took place between the Obama administration and Netanyahu. But clearly, at least relative compared to the Trump years, when the Trump administration was very close with Netanyahu, clearly this relationship is not nearly as close. And many Democrats in general, not just the Biden administration, but the Democrats in general are, I think, increasingly critical of the Israeli government. And we're seeing now, more and more Democrats in Congress, including like long-time pro-Israel Democrats, like Chuck Schumer, beginning to say a few pretty mild comments, but it just indicates the shift that is taking place, I think, within the Democratic Party when it comes to US-Israel relations.
And if the government, the Israeli government, goes as far as proposing to annex large parts of the West Bank, could Biden do anything to put enough pressure on them to try to stop that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect the Netanyahu government will make that mistake, as in make a formal announcement about annexation, precisely because that would likely injure. I mean, that's what happened even with the Trump administration, right? When Prime Minister Netanyahu, who believed he had a green light from the Trump administration to move forward with formal annexation, when he announced that, Kushner and others within the Trump administration behind the scenes, said, hold on a second, you've gone too quickly. We don't want you to formally move ahead with annexation. And let's not forget that, part of the agreement that Israel made with the UAE to reach the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates was to suspend annexation. So if they were to move forward with formal annexation by making an announcement, that would not only, I think, cause a real crisis with the Biden administration, but it would also, imperil Israel's burgeoning relationship with the UAE and some other Arab states. So I don't think that Netanyahu is going to make the same mistake twice, as in make an announcement, unless for political reasons he absolutely has to do that, which is clearly his, most main concern. Rather, I think what we're going to see is a continuation of what's already begun, which is kind of, annexation, formal annexation by stealth, a kind of just the same process of what was kind of termed creeping annexation, where about the de facto annexation of the West Bank, this gradual, slow process that you really have to pay attention to see the implications of it. So I think the same is happening with regards to now formal annexation. It's more, it's less obvious. It's often buried in seemingly, just bureaucratic, technocratic decisions. But what it's gradually doing is applying, for example, Israeli laws to settlers and to settlements in the West Bank, gradually extending the authority of Israeli civilian ministries over Israeli West Bank settlements, and effectively making at least Area C, at least 60% of the West Bank, really effectively fully under the formal control of the Israeli government. So I think we're going to more likely see that continue rather than a big announcement of annexation, just because that would likely receive a lot of pushback from the international community. And I think Netanyahu is too smart to do that, unless, as I said, he's running for re-election and he really needs to appeal to his right-wing base.
Okay, we have a number of audience questions already, but before we move to that, I just wanted to get your opinion, if you could, in just a few minutes about what's happening in the U.S. With the Jewish community and Jewish organizations. What has their response been to the recent events in Israel?
Well, as somebody who follows closely American Jewish politics, I must say that it's been striking how vocal, unusually vocal, broadly speaking, the American Jewish establishment, the organized mainstream American Jewish organizations like the federations, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, major philanthropists, long-time, pro-Israel stalwarts like Alan Dershowitz and Mike Bloomberg and others. There's been an outpouring of public criticism from really, from across much of the mainstream American Jewish community. And that's really what's unprecedented about that. It's not that American Jews don't criticize Israel, they certainly do, but those institutions, those organizations and actors have generally been very reluctant to publicly take issue with the Israeli government. Their modus operandi is to work, again, quietly behind the scenes. They may express misgivings in private meetings, but they don't really hate to go public with their criticism. And the fact that they've done so, I think, is really a sign of just how much disquiet and concern there is within the American Jewish establishment about this judicial overhaul, because I think there's a real fear that if this overhaul is enacted, it would, not only further alienate many American Jews who are already alarmed about what they see as the political trends in Israel and developments in Israel. So it would further, widen the rift between liberal American Jews and Israel, but also it would undermine or potentially even imperil the US-Israel relationship, because one of the key arguments that's always underpinned US support for Israel has been the claim that shared values, and that Israel is a democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, and that shared values, these two democracies, has long been one of the main talking points for pro-Israel groups and for the American Jewish establishment in promoting US-Israel relations. That is going to be a harder claim to make, that these countries share common values, that Israel is a fellow democracy, when you see this, if this legislation is enacted, and in particular, if it leads to, a further erosion of democratic institutions and practices in Israel. So there's a real concern there. And I think the outpouring of criticism is an expression of that concern. And it's quite remarkable. I don't think there's likely to be any sort of costs imposed. I think we're talking really about, expressions of concern rather than any real concrete actions that might give the Israeli government pause. But nevertheless, I don't think it should be belittled that this criticism coming from these kind of institutions, as I said, that have previously have been very reluctant to criticize Israel.
Okay, thank you, Dov. So I think that we're going to move to audience questions now. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Gabriella, and she's got a number of questions that she's going to pose from our audience.
Thank you very much, Saul. Yes, we do have some. I'm Gabriella Gallagher, the National Chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now, for those who don't know me. We do have a number of questions, and I will go through. We'll try to get through as many as we can, and Dov has very kindly agreed to stay a few minutes after the hour, so hopefully we'll get to most of your questions. So the first one goes back to your discussion about the technicalities of the judicial reform, and an anonymous attendee asks makes a comment that in the U.S. a political party in the majority in the a political party in the majority in the Senate, and a president of the same party can pick and fill vacant Supreme Court seats. So how is what the ruling party in Israel what it wants to do, how is that different?
Yeah, that's a great and important question, because this is, this is the argument that the supporters of the Israeli government have made. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself made this argument to media outlets in the United States, pointing out, look, the Congress politicians pick judges in the US, so this is no different. But what that ignores is the important differences between the two political systems. First of all, in the United States, you do have a separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislature, right? So yes, sometimes both the White House and the Senate is controlled by the same political party, but senators are independently elected, right? They're not as beholden to the president, unlike in the Israeli political system, where first of all, there is no separation between the executive and the legislature. So essentially, it's a parliamentary system. So the governing coalition essentially controls the legislature, and the people in the Knesset members in Israel are much less independent than our elected representatives in Congress, particularly in the Senate, where they're independently elected. So what I'm trying to say is that the system in Israel, where you have a unicameral system of where you don't have a separation between the executive and the legislature, and you only have one legislature, not two separate houses of parliament, if you will, right? You don't have the House and the Senate, or in the United Kingdom, you have the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So you have other checks and balances. In Israel, the Supreme Court is the only institution that can serve as a check on the executive branch. And not to mention, on top of all of that, those differences, in Israel, there is, of course, no written constitution or Bill of Rights. So it's really up to the Supreme Court. So whereas the American system has more checks and balances. So I don't think, you can compare the two things and simply say, well, it's politicians appointing justices. The question is, how those politicians are elected, who controls those politicians, and what other checks and balances are there in the system.
Thank you. From Henry Russian, there's a few questions, so I'm just going to ask one. He wants to know if there's any chance in the future of developing an Israeli constitution. Maybe this other question he asks is related. He's wondering if Herzog agreed to pardon Netanyahu from any charge, could there be a compromise that would lead to Netanyahu dropping judicial reform? I don't know if that's even possible, but.
Yeah, this has been something that has been mooted, not just over the last few months, but ever since Netanyahu's criminal indictments, and the campaign he's subsequently waged against the Israeli judiciary. It's been occasionally suggested that, look, it would be the less harmful course of action for Israeli democracy would be for either Netanyahu to be preemptively pardoned, or maybe to accept some sort of plea deal, which would be very mild punishment, avoid potential imprisonment, and this would solve the problem. As I said, first of all, it's important to remember that it's not just, this judicial overhaul is not just about Netanyahu trying to stay out of jail. This is something that is being pushed by the Israeli right for a long time, that Netanyahu himself has come on board, maybe because of his own legal troubles, but even if Netanyahu wasn't in the picture, you still would have a strong sentiment on the Israeli right within the Likud party, and certainly on the far right, to limit the Supreme Court's power and independence. So even if there's a sweetheart deal for Netanyahu, this doesn't remove the threat to the Supreme Court. And I also think, obviously, it is problematic from the perspective of the rule of law for anybody accused of crimes to a powerful person accused of crimes to receive some sort of pardon, right? This issue has also come up, of course, in the United States with President Trump. It came up many, many years ago with President Nixon, who was pardoned by then President Ford. And I think many historians think that was a mistake. So I'm not sure if that would be a good idea to give Netanyahu that pardon, if indeed that was even something that President Herzog might be willing to do. So that's on the question of pardon. On the question of a constitution, that is what President Herzog, or at least a Bill of Rights, has suggested. And I think, Lapid has also called for that. In an ideal world, yes. In an ideal world, Israel would have had a constitution in 1948 when it was established. In fact, when the UN Partition Resolution 181 was passed, it required Israel, the new Jewish state, to adopt a resolution. But of course, Israel back then was unable to do so, partly because of the disagreement over the relationship between religion and state. And I suspect it would be unable to do so today, where the ultra-Orthodox are even more powerful, much more powerful than they were in 1948. So while it would be absolutely desirable for Israel to have one, I'm not optimistic about the ability of the different tribes in Israeli society to agree on that, particularly on the question of religion and state. If anything, the process of trying to to draw up a constitution could only further exacerbate these social conflicts. I mean, what we've seen with this judicial overhaul is it's not just the opposition to the overhaul, that it's touched upon, more deeper divides in Israeli society. And in many ways kind of led these divisions, which have been there and festering for a long time, to really explode into the open. And I fear that the process of trying to reach a constitution would actually exacerbate these social divisions even further.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine two questions here from Murray Rubin and Martin Nasher. And this is going back to the occupation and the two-state solution. And the question is, who is more willing to negotiate for a two-state solution, the Israeli government or the Palestinian Authority? And I guess related to that is a question that betrays some anxiety as to if the Palestinians are given a state in the West Bank and Gaza, would that bring peace, or would it just bring more insecurity and trouble to Israel? Thanks.
Yeah, so on the question of who's more willing, I mean, right now, I think neither side is willing to seriously negotiate. I don't think there's any will on the Israeli government side, certainly not. They're not open to a two-state solution. So clearly negotiations with the PLO is a non-starter, because that's what the negotiations would involve. And on the PLO side, I think there's also a unwillingness at this point in time, because they understand all too well that this government is not willing to negotiate any sort of agreement that would lead to a real two-state solution, and negotiations would only serve as a kind of fig leaf, really, for the Israeli government. So they know that there's no prospect that negotiation would succeed. So I don't think there's any interest on the Palestinian side. And on top of that, of course, the Palestinians are now preoccupied with the question of who will succeed Abbas. He's 88, deeply unpopular in the waning days of his time in office. And so the question really on the Palestinian agenda is what will happen after Abbas and who will succeed him, not, negotiating with Israel. There's really no push from either the Israeli or Palestinian publics for renewed negotiations. Neither side thinks that negotiations would succeed. Neither side believes the other side is interested in a peace agreement, in a two-state solution. So I think all round, there's no will, there's no desire, motivation for serious peace talks. And that's why the Biden administration, correctly, in my opinion, hasn't tried to relaunch the peace process. Because they know that there's no desire for one, and it would only result in failure, and that failure could in turn be costly, and it could provoke more violence. So what was the second part of the question?
Oh, well, it was actually a somewhat separate question, but were the Palestinians to receive a state, would that not be dangerous for Israel? I think it's absolutely. I can absolutely understand the concerns that many Israeli Jews, many have about the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. There's no question that they have real legitimate fears about whether a Palestinian state would be able to control
Hamas, for example, would Hamas disarm? Would they be willing to give up their weapons? I very much doubt it. That could put the entire Israeli population, certainly major civilian centers, within range of Palestinian rockets, which could, not only terrorize Israelis, but really bring life in Israel to a standstill. There are real legitimate security concerns. Now, I think, and it's not just my opinion, many Israeli former security officials would say, those concerns, there are ways to address some of these concerns. We're not talking about a situation where, in the event of a Palestinian state, Israel would just completely give up its self-defense, and the Palestinian state, there would have to be a lot of precautions, whether by the Palestinian Authority or by an international force, which could be deployed, a peacekeeping force, to try to address some of those security concerns. But ultimately, I think the argument that Israel's rule in the West Bank is driven by the concern for Israeli security is belied by the fact that actually Israel's ongoing occupation of the West Bank, I would argue, is a source of insecurity to Israelis rather than security. It generates violence, it leads to Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians, and ultimately undermines Israel's security. So while I do recognize that there are security risks entailed in the establishment of a Palestinian state, from Israel's point of view, not to mention for the benefit of Palestinians, but from Israel's point of view, I think ultimately a Palestinian statehood in the long run would enhance Israeli security rather than undermine it.
Okay. A question from Awad Lubani. Hi, Awad. And I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but we'll ask you anyway. You probably do have a lot of expertise in this. He wants to know what influence the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Hamas and the resulting reconciliation with Syria and Hamas. How will that or how is that influencing the situation between Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, first of all, I think, it indicates that the rapprochement, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I don't think we should make too much of it. I don't think they're going to completely, overcome their historic rivalry and become best pals anytime soon. What they've agreed to is resuming a diplomatic relationship, which is a good thing. It's in both countries' interests, and I think it's in the interest of the Middle East as a whole. But I don't think there's going to be any sort of, regional realignment where the Saudis and the Iranians are going to team up or anything like that. So I don't think we should get too carried away by this rapprochement. But what it does indicate, at least, is that Netanyahu's hope for a normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia is, I think, unlikely in the near term. I think the Saudis, by having this rapprochement with Iran, and now just in the last couple of days by hosting a Hamas delegation, is indicating that they are, not planning any sort of normalization with Israel anytime soon. I think the Saudis are quite upset with Israel's actions, particularly on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The hope might be, to put a kind of positive spin on this, is that maybe, just maybe, the prospect for reconciliation between the Palestinian parties, Fatah and Hamas, could be encouraged by the Saudis. Back in 2007, the Saudis mediated so-called Mecca agreement between Hamas and Fatah to try to reconcile the two Palestinian parties to form a unity government. Ultimately, that went nowhere. But if the Saudis are, going to try that again to bring about Palestinian political reunification, that would be a very good thing. And it would ultimately be a good thing for the two-state solution as well, because if you want a two-state solution, you need to have a single Palestinian government that you can negotiate with, a single Palestinian authority, not these, split that you have today between the Hamas in the West Bank, in Gaza Strip, and Fatah in the West Bank. So In the short term, I don't think this is going to have a real impact on the ground in the West Bank, unless, of course, maybe the Saudis encourage Hamas to be more restrained. I mean, Hamas is one of the reasons, there are many, for why there's been this escalation of violence in the West Bank. And maybe, by having a better relationship with Hamas, the Saudis could encourage Hamas to be more restrained in the West Bank. But even maybe encourage Fatah and Hamas to get together, which would be a good thing, I think, for Israel in the long run, even though obviously it would not serve the agenda of the Netanyahu government, which want to maintain as much as possible, for as long as possible, this separation between Hamas and Fatah, because it weakens the Palestinians overall.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have just one more question after this, but before I get to that, I want to make my little pitch to the audience to remind you that we at Canadian Friends of Peace Now, we rely entirely on donations from people like you. So if you are at all moved and would like to help us continue our work of supporting peace now in Israel, and being a strong voice for progressive Zionism in Canada, I encourage you to go to our website, peacenowcanada.org, and follow the links. And it's very easy to make a donation, and we will, any donation over $10 is tax deductible, and we will so appreciate whatever you can do. So yes, just one more question, and this comes from Michael Morgenthau, and he is very impressed with the book you wrote, Trouble in the Tribe, and wonders, it is written about the US, but he wonders whether you think it relates, or how it relates to the Canadian situation. And I don't know if that's a bit of an unfair question, because you're an American expert. So if you don't have much to say about Canada, maybe just tell us a little bit about that book for those.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on Canadian Jewry, but actually before I focused on the American Jewish community in Trouble in the Tribe, initially I was planning, and my early research was looking at more broadly the relationship of the Jewish diaspora. So not just the American Jewish community. And what my broader sense is that, as I argued in Trouble in the Tribe, that there is a gradual shift in attitudes across much of the Jewish diaspora, or at least the Anglo-Jewish diaspora, in attitudes toward Israel, from what I would describe as a kind of Israel right or wrong attitude that prevailed in the 60s and 70s, where there was a real reticence about criticizing Israel, and a belief that supporting Israel meant supporting whatever Israeli governments did, to a shift from that Israel right or wrong or unconditional support to what I would call critical engagement, a greater willingness among Jews in the diaspora to reach their own conclusions about what's in Israel's interests, and to voice their opinions and to voice their criticism of Israel. My sense is that that shift has taken place not just in the United States, within the American Jewish community, but in many Jewish communities around the world. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I've observed it take place in the United Kingdom as well. I think it's occurred in Canada with the formation, for example, of J-Call, as well as Canadian Friends of Peace Now. You can see that willingness on the part of more and more Jews in the diaspora, and particularly a younger generation of Jews in the diaspora, to criticize Israel, or especially Israeli government policies, and to be more assertive and less willing to just simply toe the official line or toe the line of the mainstream Jewish establishment. Where I think maybe things differ in Canada from the US has been in terms of the establishment voice, right? The shift that I described in Trouble in the Tribe in terms of American Jewish public opinion has gradually also impacted the American Jewish establishment. As I mentioned earlier, we see this in the kind of outspoken outpouring of criticism, public criticism from mainstream establishment organizations like the ADL and the AJC and the federations. I'm not sure, I haven't at least heard, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, whether there's been an outpouring of criticism from Canadian Jewish establishment organizations, from the major organizations. That has happened in the UK, interestingly, the Board of Deputies, for example, in the United Kingdom has been really quite remarkably outspoken. But it hasn't, I think, happened as yet, or at least not that I'm aware of in Canada. It hasn't happened in other parts of the diaspora, like in France. So the picture isn't uniform. But I do think broadly, at least in the realm of public attitudes among Jews, not necessarily the organizations that claim to represent them, but on the public and certainly among young, liberal, non-Orthodox Jews, there is, I think, a real important and a shift that's taken place. It's been taking place over decades, and I think it will continue into the future.
Okay, well, you actually have brought us to I can announce that we are going to have next week at this very time a webinar that will address that issue. We've got Andrew Cohen, the prominent Canadian journalist, is going to be talking about who speaks for Canadian Jewry and whether the Canadian Jewish establishment has been responding adequately. So I encourage the audience to tune in for next week. And this now, I think we need to draw this to a close, unfortunately. Dov, you've been an incredibly articulate, clear, and fulsome speaker. Thank you for sharing your incredible expertise with us, such wide-ranging expertise. And I've learned a lot. I'm sure other people have as well. And we're delighted to have had you. And I also want to thank my fellow board member, Saul Shipp, for helping host this event. And thank the audience for participating. Please do return to our next webinar or visit our website to learn more about us. And with that, I will bid you all a good night and stay safe and be well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.